2003, we're in the home of Dr. Morton Gold in Rutland, Vermont. And I think I'll start by asking you to tell a little bit about your family background, grandparents, great-grandparents, what you know about them.
All right. Well, let's see. My mother's side, my grandparents came from Russia. I believe my mother's parents came from Minsk, and my father's parents came from Bessarabia, the town of Belz. The song Bells was composed for my father, and he introduced it. He was an actor in the Jewish theater before he became a full-time cantor. Eventually, he settled in Boston. He became president of the New England Cantors for many years. My father's parents, my father, I don't remember. My father's father died when he was young, and my father's mother and his family settled in Chicago. I had an uncle, Max, who was head of UPI in Chicago for many years. Let's see. What I can remember, my father was a cantor first in an Orthodox synagogue, Blue Hill Avenue in Boston, and later in Temple Beth Hillel, which was originally the Dorchester Mattapan Hebrew School, and eventually they merged with a congregation in West Roxbury, where he was cantor there for several years before he retired. He retired not because of any problems with his voice, but because he had a case of Parkinson's, which was probably brought on by the big influenza after the First World War. Anyway, I went to school in New York. I studied music at the 3rd Street Settlement Music House. I knew many of the composers for the Jewish theater. Shalom Secunda frequently was a guest at our home. And Alexander Olshanetsky, who composed Bells, for reasons that I can't explain, gave me a baton when he saw me one day, and that was a deadly thing to do, but I've been conducting, or trying to conduct ever since. When I was in Boston, I went to Boston University. I got my Bachelor of Music there. In practice, I graduated just before my 21st birthday. Got a Master of Arts in Teaching, because one teacher said, Gold, what are you going to do next year? And I had no plans. He said, well, how are you going to make a living? I said, I don't know. Well, you should investigate teaching. So that's why I became a teacher. That's how I became a teacher. And after a few years of teaching experience, I taught at a small school in Maine for several years. And it's odd there because one of my students became my daughter's mother-in-law. Fate has a funny way of working. And I got a doctorate in music and composition. My major teacher was Hugo Norden. I was also at Tanglewood for several summers, studying choral conducting. It's an interesting little story I can tell you. I was asked to conduct the first performance of some motets by a Chilean composer. It was a great honor. It was the first North American performance. And I said to Hugh Ross, who was the head of the choral department, I said, it's a great honor, Mr. Ross, but you understand, I don't know Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. And he looked at me as only Hugh Ross could have looked at somebody and said, but Gould, you do know music, don't you? Thank you very much, Mr. Ross. That was the end of that discussion, and there was no more. I taught for many years at a small college in Maine, Nassau College, which was in Sanford Spring, which is in Springvale, which is southwest of Portland. It's about 45 minutes. And I became very friendly with cantor Kurt Messerschmidt, who was the cantor of Beth El in Portland. And he performed, gave the first performance of my sacred service, well, not all of it, but most of it, which is a very daring thing for him to do because it's not an easy piece. I was at Nassau until from Nassau from 19. Well, I skipped something. I was choral conductor, choir leader actually for cantor Oh my goodness, Michael Hammerman at Kellis Israel in Boston. It's in Brookline, and I can tell you many stories about him. Anyway, nice stories. And I was organist and choir director at Temple Emmanuel in Providence. My mother-in-law recently died, and I was in the chapel there, and the assistant rabbi knew who I was and said, well, does it look any different from when you were here many years ago? I said, yes. Well, I noticed the organ, there's a little electric organ that they had in the corner in the chapel. I said, yes, it's not here any longer. And he was trying to choose his words very carefully. He said, it went the way of organs, which is a nice way of phrasing it. Because when I was there, I had a very large choir, and the organ was used every Friday night and Saturday morning. And for the holidays, I had a chorus of 15, 16 people, and there was a choir at the second congregation, and there was a smaller choir that's used in the third congregation in the meeting house. But I guess I was recently at a service there, and the organ wasn't used at all on Saturday. Fact is, they had the cantor standing not on the pulpit but in the congregation, which I thought was hideous. Any formality should go just only so far. I mean,
did I hear correctly? Years ago, I remember I thought I came across some reference to that the organs were not. Organs were sort of appropriated by synagogues in the late 19th century, that they weren't part of traditional Jewish music. Is that right?
That's correct, but earlier in the Middle Ages, one pope said he didn't want an organ in the church because it's too much of a Jewish instrument. That goes back when, but if you want to look at the reasons for the organ in the Reform temples, they wanted to make things as respectable as possible, and that included having not only a cantor but having a mixed choir. In fact, the cantor didn't even have to be Jewish, and many times he was a cantorial soloist. But having said that, some of the greatest music that was composed for the synagogue was not only done by people like Lewandowski in Berlin, but also Sulzer in Vienna, in Hamburg, in Paris, and Novakovsky in Russia. There's one of the synagogues was called the Choral Synagogue, and they had large choirs, and organs were used even in Poland, which was a surprise to me. There was a CD of an organist who recorded but much of Lewandowski's organ music, and he had recorded it in a synagogue in Poland. And which was a surprise to me, because one associates Poland basically with Orthodox synagogues and so on, and it came as a surprise to me. We have a trend nowadays, and it's grown over the last 20 years, and I've been a bit of a kvetch. I write a column for the Jewish Post and Opinion, which is published in Indianapolis, and along with trends towards informality and less and less the people who occupy the position of cantors are really cantors. They try to save a little bit of money, so they eliminate the position of cantor, and they have people in the congregation occupying the role of a cantor who don't know diddly squat about davening, and of course the idea of singing with an organ is much too difficult for them. So they either daven without an organ, or they daven with a guitar, or they daven without anything, which is just as well, because I don't want to get into that. I
can ask you some more.
Yeah.
So you're New England born. New York, or you went to school in New York.
Boston.
In Boston, okay. But somehow or other you found your way to first Maine and then now in Vermont. And so I'm very curious, in particular, what your experience has been living, well, in an area where Jews are essentially almost an invisible minority, or more, maybe that's not true. I don't know.
It is. I was fortunate in that the rabbi of the Jewish Center here was a very musical person, and he knew about me, oddly enough. He knew about my Haggadah. And he encouraged me to perform my music in the center, And I had the good fortune of having the people in the community at large, educators, support me in this enterprise. I have a chorus of about 18, 20 people that have sung with me over the years. All but two of them are not Jewish. And it was very easy to teach them Hebrew because they were starting from scratch, and I didn't have to correct any words. Although there was one Jewish lady who likes to say Melech instead of Melech, but she's the only one who mispronounces anything. Fact is, I'm doing for my concert on the 4th of May a Hashkevenu that I composed in 1955 that I'm doing with the Ashkenazic diction, and there's sometimes I have trouble. I say. Haporet, no, haporet, no, haporet, just like it's written. Haporet shalom. No, in this piece we say olenu. In this piece we say alenu. But in this piece that I wrote, we say alenu, because that's how it's pronounced nowadays. And they look at me and they shake their heads because I've had more support from the non-Jewish community than I have from the Jewish community in my concerts. This is the first time that, outside of having my Haggadah performed in the Paramount and the Proverbs of the Sages, which was based on Pirkei Avot, which I did at the College of St. Joseph last year, all my concerts have been at the Jewish Center. This is the first time that I'm presenting it in a venue other than the Center. And it's an interesting story there. I had the date reserved May 18th, but I have a woodwind quintet that is playing a new piece of mine. And in fact, as they premiered it at at Castleton a few weeks ago, they couldn't do it on the 18th because the Chamber Music Society, they're faculty members, and they're giving a concert in the afternoon, so they didn't want to play that evening, which I can understand. So I had to move it. I couldn't move it back to the week before because it was an all-state weekend, and besides there was a bat mitzvah in the center, and I couldn't move it ahead. It's Memorial Day weekend, which is bad time for a concert. So the only date that seemed to be left was the 4th of May, and there's a rummage sale in the center. So I mentioned this to the pastor of the church where I play the organ. I play the organ at a Lutheran church. In fact, I think I'm the only Jewish organist in the country that's got a clause in the contract saying I'm excused from playing on any major Jewish holiday. And they've been very nice to me. So she suggested, the pastor was a lady, suggested that I give my concert there in the church. Well, at first I was going to give it in the social hall, the fellowship hall. The acoustics there are really awful. But the acoustics in the church are very good. And as I wrote in this article, that there was one of my singers said, I don't know how some people would feel about this big cross at the front of the church. I said, yeah, but you didn't put it there. So I said, you're right, I didn't. Actually, when my Haggadah was done in New Jersey, in Trenton, it was done at a very large cathedral there. And if you ever see the tape of it used to be on public television regularly in the late 70s, early 80s. The first thing, there's a shot of the big cross at the foot of the church, and it goes back, and then you see the chorus and the orchestra and the table with wine and so on at the table. So it's not strange for me to have a concert of Jewish music at a church. As I said, the people here have been extremely nice and generous and forthcoming, and I'm just hoping that people in the Jewish community support a program of this kind. I mean, if there was some personality, somebody playing guitar, or once there was a rabbi, the hippie rabbi, what was his name? It's at the tip of my tongue. I can't think of his name, but he was here. That's more or less a novelty. So if something like that, then the Jewish community would come for something. But for a serious concert, I don't think it's much of an attraction for them. So we'll see how many people actually show up.
Now, the Jewish Center that you're referring to, is that in Rutland?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know its history? how long it's been around, how many people it serves?
That's an interesting question. Rabbi Goldberg would be the good one to give you an answer to that, except he's out of town right now. He retired there after 42 years in the same place. The building itself, I think, is on the historic buildings. It started out as a library. It was built by somebody in the Civil War, right after the Civil War. It's on Library Avenue. That's why it's called Library Avenue. And the sanctuary itself holds about, I would guess, about 80 to 100 people. And that's pushing it. I don't think they can get any more than that in. In fact, as if they can get that many, I never counted. They have a large meeting hall downstairs, which they use for the high holidays and for bar mitzvahs and celebrations.
How many people will show up for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur?
Between 200 and 300. But for an ordinary Saturday, you're lucky if you get 15 or 16. It's for Pesach once we had a minyan, but there was one person that had to leave, so we didn't have a minyan. It's like that. So it varies. Now this Friday night, tonight, there'll be a very large crowd at the synagogue because they're bringing in some speaker from Israel. So they will have the place will be filled. But outside of that, on a Friday night, they really don't have more than 24 or so people. In the summertime, they used to have large attendance, mostly because the snowbirds who went to Florida are here at Killington and various places, so they would come to services on Friday night and Saturday. The services were fairly traditional services. Our services nowadays are not fairly traditional, so in a sense that people who used to go to services regularly aren't going. And there are some people that rarely go to services are still not going to services very often. So you have a problem, and I don't really want to go over there any much more than that. As far as my music is concerned, I skipped an awful lot. I started out by writing a lot of instrumental music. I conducted a couple of pieces of mine at the Boston Pops. Both time at the invitation of Arthur Fiedler. Then I was commissioned to write Haggadah by Cantor Harold Lerner in Syracuse. And when the dust cleared after about 20 years, I realized I had 6 oratorios that I had written, all of them commissioned and all of them with orchestral accompaniment. And I like a lot of company when I go to work. I don't like to be there by myself. And a sacred service, plus various other instrumental pieces, chamber pieces, and my dissertation was a piano concerto, which I was fortunate enough to play once. It's not easy for somebody to get performances with a professional orchestra. They usually, if something is performed in Lincoln Center or on television, then local pieces, orchestras and groups will try to do the same thing, no matter how difficult it is. They'll try and do it. But my piece is not that difficult and it's not that radical, so it's tough to get performances. I'm sorry.
I would also think that, again, living so far away from any of the major metropolitan areas, it must be hard for you to get the publicity and or even just get pull these things together, find the musicians.
Well, the musicians are here. There are a lot of good local musicians in the area, both vocal and instrumental. I was fortunate enough to make friends with a tenor by the name of Wayne Hobbs, who's now located in Burlington. He has a magnificent tenor, and he handles the cantorial parts that I've written with ease. My father was a tenor. Whenever I composed for a cantor, I had my father's voice in mind. In fact, this is a story that my composition teacher knew my father was a Chazan, so he suggested that I write something for him to sing. And I said to my father, tell me, should I write this for baritone or should I write this for tenor? And he just looked at me. I still remember that look. He said, write whatever you want and I'll sing it. And he did. So I composed a piece that has a range from middle C to high B flat, and I made a baritone version from B to high A, which is an impossible. It takes a darn good baritone or a darn good tenor to sing either one, either version. And he had to sing that after Shavuos, I remember. After services were over, the concert was that night, which was and at the time he was in an Orthodox shul. They opened up the siddur and nothing was left out, and there was no responsive reading either. Occasionally, the rabbi would announce what page people would be on, but that was it. That was his breather. But outside of, I still hear my father's voice. And when I see what's going on in the synagogue today with Chazanim, or the lack of Chazanim, I just shake my head and say, well, where are all the Jews? What happened? Where are all these people that go to symphony concerts and ballet concerts and the opera? There are lots of Jews on these board of directors. Where are they? Where do they go to shul? Do they go to shul altogether? And do they settle for this sort of helter-skelter that's going on in the synagogues now? I just shake my head and wonder what's going on now, or what has gone on. But what has gone on has happened, and this is what it is right now. So I have to deal with it, but I don't have to like it.
Well, what's your sense of? I think I've got this number right. I think there's something like approximately 5,000 Jews in all of Vermont.
That may be an exaggeration.
May be fewer than that. In any case, those. What is your sense of Jews in Vermont? Did they all get here in the last 20 years? Do you know some Jewish people here who've been here a long, long time? And also, what do you know? I mean, are for the most part, are Jews living in Vermont primarily professionals, educators, artists, or do you have a broader sense?
Not so much artists, I don't think, but there are a lot of professional people. There used to be, and there still are, a lot of business people. The main Jewish, wherever there's a large urban center, you'll find Jews. And it's true in Burlington. There's a large Jewish community there. There are two synagogues, I believe, in Burlington. One a conservative, the other Reform. There are lots of small synagogues, and not said lots. There are several small synagogues. I know there's one in Reconstructionist, one in Manchester, and the one here in Rutland was conservative and technically still is, although it's pretty much Reconstructionist now. There's there's a congregation in Woodstock, and I don't know. There are probably a few others in the state, but I don't know where. I'm not one to be very adventurous in going from place to place, so I've never been to the one in Manchester. There's another fairly large congregation by Vermont, and it's just over the border in Glens Falls, New York. Fact is, the rabbi who auditioned for the pulpit here decided to go to Glens Falls instead. And some people from this congregation do go to Glens Falls, or have been, but it's an hour away, and it's I don't know. It seems too much of a trip to go to the synagogue when you have this one that's 5 minutes away. To answer your question, I don't know when the predominant settling of Jews in Vermont, they were not so much educators, but small entrepreneurs and business people, and then professional people shortly followed in their footsteps. There are several lawyers that I know of here in Rutland. There's a dentist. There's a large furniture store that is Jewish owned, and there are a few other Jewish enterprises locally. But everybody counts. There's no fat. It's all muscle. And the community is a small one. I don't think there are more than 100 or 125 families in the Jewish Center, members of the Jewish Center, and there are some that aren't members altogether.
I think you said before that, at least as regards your music, that you find a great deal of support in the among non-Jews. But in general, what is the sense of is it easy to be a Jew in a place like this? I mean, aside from the issues of how far many people have to travel to get to shul, is it easy? Are people free of anti-Semitism, even in these rural areas?
If there is anti-Semitism, and I don't doubt that there is, it's discreet. I mean, I don't know of any. I never had any problems, and the fact is, when I came in to teach originally, I taught at the Rutland schools for 8 years, and I've been teaching in a parochial high school now for the last 8 years. I've never had any trouble taking off for Jewish holidays. I've never had any trouble taking, if I needed an hour off to attend Yiska service, so I would have to miss an afternoon class. I've never had any problems that way, because I've always been open and above board in that. There are some people, I'm sure, it's a question of measure of commitment and belief, and who feel squeamish or reluctant or something like that. And so you can be as Jewish as you choose to be in this area. I don't know, as I said, there are probably, it might be disguised as anti-Israel as opposed to anti-Jewish, but there's some of that in Vermont. But so far as I can determine, and I've been here now 16 years, I personally have not experienced any anti-Semitism, which is a remarkable thing to say, but in my case it's true.
I was gonna. Oh, you had mentioned before being in. Oh yeah, when do you have to leave?
About 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, you mentioned before having spent some time in Maine.
Yeah.
And where was that in Maine?
In Ellsworth.
Uh-huh.
No, excuse me, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. Well, I was in Ellsworth for 2 years when I first started to teach, but I was at a college, Nassau College, I was living in Sanford Springvale.
Is that anywhere near Portland?
It's about 45 minutes south of Portland.
Okay, so when you were there, you could go to shul in Portland, I take it. Yeah.
That was a very heavily French Catholic community,
Uh-huh.
and there was a lot of Baptists there. There was one. At that time I played the organ in a Unitarian church, and I also played the organ in a Methodist church for a while. And I played in a very large congregational church in Kennebunkport. In fact, as that was President Bush's church, I found that afterwards. So I haven't had any problems. Because as you can plainly see, the living room still has Pesach things in it, and I haven't packed up. And this year, excuse me,